Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom in our continuing discussion of the expanding Industrial Revolution. And then also, we're going to move into a completely new topic today, right? Not new topic along the lines of like new unit or anything like that, but it's still a part of what the College Board considers Unit 6, right? So going through all the standards and stuff like that, crunching down some of this old Prezi and really kind of getting more to the core principles of it, I've managed to actually kind of really like liquidate it down quite a bit. So we're actually going to be able to kind of keep this flip a little bit on the shorter side and like not kind of get overdone and stuff like that. But the number one thing about it is though, is if I'm giving this to you bare bones, you need to remember that you got to come in and ask for help if you need it. Okay. So like, just like send me an email, shoot me an email, we'll figure it out and stuff like that. But if you get it, then that's awesome. And we're all moving in the right direction. But where we left off in class, we were talking about labor movements, right? We're talking about the earliest labor movements that had broken out following the beginning of liberal reform that we had also discussed in class today as well. We talked about the Mines Act, the Factories Act, the 10-Hour Act, and things like that came out that began to limit the amount of work that a child could do. And it also began to limit the amount of work that a woman could do. And we talked about the cult of domesticity. And of course, those laws are going to actually be the driving force behind that cult of domesticity and the separate spheres of labor that are going to begin to bar women from certain types of work. Now, we began talking in class, talking about, well, what about the men? What about the men that are still working in the factories? What about the men that are still working in the mines? What about them? Well, who is the one advocating for them? Well, then you're going to see the creation of these things called amalgamated societies, aka what you would call in the modern era a union, right? The earliest unions were organized, they performed strikes, they bettered working conditions, right, and things like that. Now, for those of y'all who don't know what a union is, again, we tried to talk about this a little bit in class, but what a union is, it's a collection of workers, right, that try to fight and advocate for better conditions for the laborers inside of a factory or a place of work, right? So basically, in essence, the factories would collectively like come together and they would say, look, warden, look, or not warden, but look, foreman, that's the word I'm looking for. Look, foreman, look, owner, we don't get very good conditions, right? We don't get fair working hours, fair working pay. We don't have a break room. We don't have a lot of different things, right? So if you don't give us what we want, we're all going to go on strike, and then you're not going to be able to make money anymore, right? So labor unions kind of create the bridge between the worker and the owner of the business to try and create more fair and stable conditions, right? Now, eventually, though, these amalgamated societies are going to grow into legitimate unions that are very, very politically active, right? For example, you have the Amalgamated Society of Paper Workers right there, which is a paper workers union. You have the Amalgamated Society of Woodworkers right here, who is a woodworkers union. And unions still exist very much today and are a very powerful force in the working world, and they also are very, very great when it comes to collective bargaining and also getting better rights for workers, right? Now, going into it, though, now we have to begin to talk about the spread of industrialization to the continent, okay? Now, so when we say the continent, we need to understand what Mr. Terry is getting at, right? So we need to understand that what we're talking about here is how the Industrial Revolution is going to leave Great Britain, and it's going to hop over the English Channel, and it's going to begin to spread in continental Europe, right? It's going to spread in places like France, what will eventually become Germany. It's going to spread in places like the Netherlands to a degree, Spain, like other areas as well, and it's going to kind of go all the way into northern Italy and the like. Now, there's some areas that won't industrialize for a really long time. I'm looking at you, Russia. Now, the thing about it, though, going into it, it is going to be a slow process, and it's going to go move at very different speeds for different areas of the continent, okay? Now, issues that were preventing industrialization early on, and the reason why they actually didn't like industrialize right alongside of Great Britain and do it earlier or do it at their same pace, a lot of it has to do with this list that you actually see in front of you. You've got inflation, you've got destruction also as well, because we need to remember the havoc that the Napoleonic era actually really wreaked. So, like, we have to actually kind of, like, lump the destruction and Napoleon one together. Inflation, though, and inflationary expenses and different forms of currency is going to be an impediment as well. Money for investment, right? The thing about it is that you have to understand is that they didn't have a ton of like lenders or a ton of people that actually were able to invest in large-scale industrialization. And then also revolution's going to stand in the way, and secrets don't make friends. Something that we need to understand though as well, on top of all these different things, right, with Napoleon, the French Revolution, and all these things sweeping over the continent and preventing their ability to industrialize in the 1700s, you have to also understand one key thing. One, Britain still had more resources than a lot of these places. They still had more access to iron and coal, and so that's going to actually give them that kind of kickstart to the entire thing before everybody else. And two, when they begin to industrialize, Britain makes direct efforts to keep industrial secrets inside of their country. Now, what I mean by that is that British inventors and British industrialists literally told people and told the government to pass laws to make it so that you could not actually sell British industrial ideas outside of Great Britain, to keep them inside of Great Britain at all costs, and that if you were caught actually transferring these ideas to other places, you could be arrested and there could be several penalties, right? Now in 1850 though, a lot of people consider that, or a lot of historians consider that, the starting line, okay? And the question is though, is that in 1815, why is that such a big year? Because that's going to be the year that Napoleon gets exiled for the second time, right? Now can they catch up though, okay? Can these other countries catch up to Great Britain and close that gap? Well, according to this graph, one does, right? One of them does by 1900 and things like that, but lots of them actually do their best to catch up, but even though they never quite get there, right? So now looking at these guys, you have to understand that the United Kingdom is going to be very industrialized, but look at this little cross section right here. That right there is the United States of America, right? Now, and then also you've got Germany as well, that was dramatically on the rise by about 1915, and they got so dangerously close that they actually created a little bit of resentment and some political disdain between the countries of Great Britain and then the country of Germany as well. So that actually is going to help lead to some animosity, possibly World War I. But then if you look at some of these other guys down here, right, like Austria, which never really industrialized that much, Italy, which basically was just headquartered in northern Italy when it came to industrialization, and France did its best, but it never really quite caught up, right? So going into it, though, we have to understand how the continent is going to gain steam, though. How are areas in the continent going to gain the ability to industrialize, and how are they going to move forward? Well, a lot of it, first of all and foremost, has to do with the fact that the idea that keeping those secrets keeping those secrets inside of Great Britain is going to be borderline impossible, right? So British technology and workers are going to end up selling to other European countries. A very good example of this is called the Cockerill family. The Cockerill family actually sold some of the earliest models of the spinning jenny and other devices from textile manufacturing to other areas of Europe. They actually went directly over there and smuggled those secrets away and actually began to sell them off, right? The other thing that you have to understand though as well is whereas in Britain there was a lot of private investment, creating a very burgeoning and large middle class, industrial middle class, that were business owners that are going to actually kind of be able to start large-scale businesses and processing manufacturing plants as well as digging mines. The government, though, the governments of countries in the continents are going to have to get directly involved, okay? So the government of France, post-Napoleon, is going to have to get directly involved in investing in the growth of industrialization in the continent. You're going to see Prussia get very, very involved in industrialization, and they're going to directly fund their expansive, the expanse of industrialization in their area. Now, how are they going to do this, though? When the government gets directly involved, they're going to first and foremost put up tariffs, right? They're going to put tariffs on British goods and several other goods that are going to be coming from other countries to try and make it so it's more appetizing to buy the industrialized goods that are coming out of their countries, right? Also, you're going to see railroads laid by governments, not privateers. So the thing that we've got to understand is in Great Britain, the parliament pushed for private companies to lay railroads all over the continent, all over the Isle of Great Britain, so they can move goods and products as fast as possible, whereas in other countries, it was actually laid directly by the government. And they would actually charge you to use those rails, right, which is actually the more modern-day model anyway. Now, industry, though, became tied to national pride as well, which is a big thing you have to understand when it comes to economic nationalism, right? So the level of industrialization and the level of devices that were actually being produced inside of your country are going to be a very, very large thing that's going to bolster your feeling of nationalism. For example, there was a very famous family that was a German family called the Krupp family that we'll talk about a little bit later on that were very, very well known for making weapons, right? And so Germany became highly militarized, right? So going into it, though, we need to also understand that corporate banks and limited liability protection is going to be a big thing as well. Corporate banks, what I mean by that is there was a lot of money in the continent, okay? A lot of money in banks, in the banking industry, and in finance. And so what you have to understand is they all began to offer these types of loans known as limited liability loans, where basically the person who's actually going out trying to, remember we talked about Callie Barber in class, she's going to start a business, right? And when she starts a business, she's taking a very large risk, and if she loses everything, she could end up actually losing all of her savings and owing some in the long run. limited liability loans make it so investors in like France, so if you have like an Emily Lodeux, like she's going to go off and start her company using a little bit limited liability loan, which is going to protect her a little bit. And it's going to make it a little more appetizing for her to actually create a company because she is only going to lose however much she puts in, right? So like if she actually puts in her savings, she might lose her savings if the company goes bankrupt, but she won't end up owing anything. Now, by this point in time, when the industrialization of the continent begins to spread, the British are just going to become very aware of it, and they end up being like, all right, fine, we're just going to show off then. Because remember that graph about how much further ahead Great Britain was than the other countries in the continent? They decided to build a giant building that just kind of dedicated the idea that the British are not stoppable. And this thing is called the Crystal Palace, right? The Crystal Palace was built in 1851, and it was basically Britain showing off the Industrial Revolution and being like, oh, well, I know that y'all are beginning to industrialize on the continent, but look how great we are. The Crystal Palace was a giant building that was like hundreds of thousands of square feet that actually was built completely out of glass and iron, right? All glass, all iron framework, and this is what it looked like on the inside. And it was meant to hold expo halls. It was basically a convention center where they would actually show off inventions of their industrial era. And this is kind of a really, really great thing to look at because it demonstrates, again, just how advanced Britain was and the lead that they had on these other continental people, or on these other continental countries. So, like, the thing about it, though, is that also you can't, unfortunately, go visit the Crystal Palace anymore because it burned down in the 1880s. Now, going into it, though, okay, we're now going to leave the Industrial Revolution for a little while. We'll come back to it at the end of this unit, right? At the end of this unit, we're going to talk about second wave industrialization and how from about 1870 to 1914, you're going to see like a giant leap forward in industrialization. We're also going to talk about getting poop out of the streets, which is going to be a really good time. So going into it, though, you have to understand we're now moving into what's known as the Concert of Europe, right? We are talking right now about the Concert of Europe and the rise of European conservatism, okay? So we're starting off again at about 1850. Now, quick review, okay? Let's make sure we remember the Congress of Vienna, the balance of power, and the spreading idea of revolution, right? So as of 1815, Napoleon has now been exiled the second time. He's been exiled the second time, and he's now like on an island known as St. Helena off the coast of Africa, right? Of course, in about 6 short years, in 1821, he's going to die of stomach cancer. The thing about it, though, is that now that he's actually been ousted completely, you still have the lingering elements of the French Revolution kind of stuck to everything all over the continent because everything Napoleon took over and touched is going to have to now be recut up, kind of positioned, and then puzzled all back together inside of Europe. And of course, the meeting that actually was held to do that was called the Congress of Vienna, right? And the goal of the Congress of Vienna was going to be to create that thing known as the balance of power, right? And if the balance of power is going to put the power back into the hands of conservative monarchies, that is what they believed to be the concert of Europe, or the Congress system, right? This idea basically stating that like these large conservative countries like Prussia, Russia, Austria, like the new like Bourbon France, and then also Great Britain are going to increase their size, and they're going to make it so they actually repel, destroy, and stop any future revolution from happening. Because it kind of freaks people out when a reign of terror happens, right? Now, under a guy named Clemens von Metternich, the conservative Quadruple Alliance, right? He also himself is extremely conservative, okay? So the thing that we need to understand, though, is the conservative Quadruple Alliance, which includes Great Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, are going to actually seek to reestablish what is known as the status quo, right? Now, status quo, what that word means, is basically Europe before the revolution ever even broke out, right? They want to go back to absolutist Europe. They want to go back to Europe before the Enlightenment told people they had rights, right? They want to go back to the fact that economies are directly regulated by the government, and they're also like there to uphold the rights and privileges of the landed aristocracy, right? So basically, in an essence, Clemens von Metternich and his buddies were fighting for a dying system. Because if we look around today, landed aristocracy is not really a big thing that dictates politics in Europe, right? So you have to understand that they were trying their best to reestablish that old type of Europe, that 1600s Louis XIV Palace of Versailles type of like actual like conservative monarchy, right? Now, there are other thinkers out there other than just Clemens von Metternich. By the way, he's known as Prince Clemens von Metternich. He is actually one of those. Remember when we talked about Martin Luther and the German princes, right? The princes that actually kept Martin Luther safe, and like and his safety was actually kept by them while like Charles V was on the hunt for him and stuff like that. He's actually descendant of those princes, right? He actually owns some principality territory inside of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire, but now is going to be known as the German Confederation. But he is one of those old princes that owns a lot of that land, so that's where he comes from, right? But he actually works in Austria, and he is Austrian, okay? So don't get it confused. He's not German, but he speaks German, but he's actually Austrian. So, like, going into it, though, he's also not alone. There are other thinkers that actually agree with him, right? You got people like Edmund Burke, who is an English conservative who believes that people have no ability to rule for themselves. And then you also have Joseph de Maistre, which is actually a French revolutionary citizen who, when the actual revolution broke out, he supported the revolution completely. But then when the Reign of Terror showed up, he literally was horrified by what could happen when you gave people the right to lead themselves. And he then reverted back to conservative ideology and thought they needed to bring back an absolute monarch. So as you can tell, the French Revolution has changed a lot of minds, right? And it has now created a spectrum in Europe when it comes to politics and political understanding. And you've got conservatism on the far right, classical liberalism there in the middle, and then you have socialism on the far left, right? Now, when we look at them, you have to also understand the easiest way to remember who they are and start getting into the idea of what they believe in. By the way, do me a favor, go ahead and start reading that little graphic organizer that I posted on your, on your actual Google Classroom, right? It's a lot easier to understand who they are if you understand who they represent, right? Socialists represented the working class, and then the classical liberals actually represented the middle class, and conservatives represented the upper class or the aristocrats, right? So your Clemens von Metternichs are conservatives. Your Edmund Burkes are conservatives. Your Joseph Maistres are conservatives because they actually represent that upper class aristocracy, right? Now, over on the conservative side, you also have an alliance within an alliance, okay? Now, some of you are going to get really annoyed with this, and this is what I mean by some of y'all starting to get confused, okay? There's also another alliance. You had the Quadruple Alliance that actually went to the Congress of Vienna, chopped up France, and got it all situated and repuzzled Europe altogether after the fallout of Napoleon. But then you had this other group called the Holy Alliance, right, which is the hyper-conservative group within the Quadruple Alliance that all have absolute monarchies, that all have aristocrats that they want to use to run their governments, right? And those are like inside the Holy Alliance is Prussia, Russia, and Austria, right? Those guys are going to do everything they can to prevent liberal ideas from spreading around the continent and to make sure that that a French Revolution never happens again, right? Now, Metternich's goals, if you had to actually argue what Metternich wanted to do, Clemens von Metternich, okay, he wants to restore the balance of power of Europe by reinstalling legitimate rulers and monarchs. Things that he hates and wants to avoid, things that conservatives hate and want to avoid, are a big thing known as a legislative body, right? You have to remember something very important. Conservatives hate legislative bodies and they hate constitutions, right? Because those things give people a voice because you are voting for your representatives to represent you in that legislative branch. They also give people rights. And the thing about it is, they don't like rights for people because they think they got too much to say, right? Now, they also, though, as well, like Metternich, and of course, the conservatives as well, one of their goals is to uphold the old rights of the aristocracy and suppress liberalism and socialism at all costs, right? Now, the other third one, though, is to reinstall religion as the backbone of stable states. They want to bring the Catholic Church back into any country that it was gotten rid of in, right? They believe that the moral backing of Christianity is what keeps people from revolting, which is really disturbing when you think about it, because if you really look at it, rich people thought that church would keep people docile. It's kind of unfortunate. Now, anyway, so really quick, though, also you have to understand is how did they do this? How did they manage to accomplish this? Well, they actually did this through a lot of different methods, right? One of them includes this thing known as the Carlsbad Decrees, which actually came out in 1819 and were passed inside of Austria, right? This actually was a direct attempt to suppress liberal ideas, to prevent nationalist organizations from popping up, and then also it went as far as to put spies inside of universities to prevent liberal professors from expanding on the ideas of the revolution and teaching students inside of universities on how to actually advocate for their rights and the roles of the Enlightenment thinkers, right? So something you always got to understand is old school conservatives and stuff like that from this era, right? I'm talking about from this era before anybody gets upset about it. All right, so now from this era, literally hate the idea of the university professor teaching students, because it has always been those academics who are very, very progressive and liberal-minded, right? Another big thing about it, though, as well, is they're going to try and hold on to serfdom. Places like Russia, in particular in the Holy Alliance, are going to try and prevent the spread of liberal ideas by keeping serfdom locked into place, right? And trying to prevent the downfall of feudalism. They're also going to crush nationalist organizations whenever they pop up. So anytime anytime a group of people come together where they want to try and start their own country, they're going to crush that organization before it ever gets off of its feet, right? And they also want to destroy constitutions. A good example of this is the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, where in the southern portion of Italy, they actually wanted to create a constitution that was a liberal constitution and then bring in a voted-in legislative body. They sent a massive army down there and literally crushed that entire idea. So they are willing to use violence to hammer this down. Because you have to think of the conservatives at the time in Europe. A lot like if any of you have hardwood floors at home. My mom and dad, when I was younger, we had hardwood floors at my dad because my dad built our house, right? So you have to understand, though, we have nails that sit in our floor. And every now and again, from just walking around, the nails will begin to kind of migrate up, right? Think of that as liberal ideas, right? Liberal ideas being like revolution and then constitutions and the legislative branch. The conservatives, though, are the hammer that want to come back in and pound that back down into place before it can actually get going and before it can catch anybody's toe, right? This era, though, that is going to be designed by these different goals is known as the Age of Metternich, right? And it lasted from 1815 to 1848, and this time period was considered an era of oppressive peace, right? Basically, from 1815 to 1848, you had almost 30 years of no war in Europe. Now, here's the ultimate irony. These conservatives came in and they basically prevented war from breaking out, which is a good thing because people didn't die. But at the same time, you did it by suppressing and crushing people's ideas. And suppressing and crushing progressive ideas. So going into it, you got to understand, before we get any further, that when I say oppressive peace, it's because I mean legitimately oppressive peace. Because if anybody ever actually kind of tried to have a revolt, the revolt would be crushed. Now, the interesting thing here is also, let's kind of hinge on one key concept. We're talking about no war in Europe between European countries. So Prussia wasn't going against Austria, but was Prussia and Austria crushing revolts that were popping up in their countries? Yes. So it was basically more like countries were fighting themselves and people that cared and wanted to give people rights instead of actually fighting each other. So we're going to go ahead and cut it off right there, though. And I'll see y'all tomorrow in class. Y'all have a good one.